Hi there, it's Anna Jones here on The Daily today, and we're going to begin the podcast talking about Vladimir Putin's big annual State of the Nation address.
Спасибо, прошу вас. Прошу, добрый день. Уважаемые...
Well, Russia's president had plenty to say, threatening nuclear war if allied NATO forces went into Ukraine.
Что все это реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации.
On Wednesday, Estonia's Prime Minister told Sky News that Western leaders should keep all options on the table in order to stand up to Putin.
We shouldn't be afraid of our own power. Defence is not escalation.
And earlier this week, French President Emmanuel Macron floated the idea of sending troops to Ukraine, though NATO allies rejected that suggestion. But Baltic states, who are all NATO members, have been bolstering their defences along the borders with Russia. We're going to hear from Sky's security and defence editor Deborah Haynes a little bit later about her trip to speak to some of the people there. But first, our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn on Putin's big speech. So, Dominic, these addresses are never short, are they? President Putin covered a lot of ground. What did you make of it?
Vladimir Putin, at the beginning of this war, didn't really hold these press conferences and these addresses, and there was a real sense of him being in the Kremlin bunker as things turned against him. He's now someone who, for a while, has been quite prepared to come out and meet the cameras and talk to politicians, members of parliament and journalists. And I think in this address, he had two audiences in mind. He had the domestic audience. It's a couple of weeks ahead of the Russian elections, if you can call them elections, are effectively an appointment. But he's sending a clear message to the Russians, which we've heard before, that this war is going well. He insists. But Russia is under attack. The West is trying to weaken it. And it's the patriotic duty of all Russians to rally around him and the soldiers as they defend the motherland. We've heard that for a while from him, but he's reinforcing that, and a real sense that this war is not nearly over. It's going to go on and on. But there was a real note of not triumphalism, but certainly sort of growing optimism and confidence in what he was saying, that the war is moving in the direction, finally, that Russia would like to see it going in after 2 years of setbacks. And of course, the other audience was the diplomats abroad, Western leaders, but I think also particularly Ukrainians, because we've been hearing from him and his diplomats for a while now, this kind of propaganda diplomatic offensive, which is trying to give the impression that they are going to win the war, the Russians, that the Ukrainians were foolish to resist, that resistance was futile, and the West has been stupid and foolish to support that resistance, and saying to the Ukrainians that the West is giving up. So it's trying to demoralise the enemy.
There were some stark warnings as well for NATO countries as well, weren't they? He talked about any deployment of Western troops in Ukraine having tragic consequences. I mean, is that a direct rebuttal of President Macron of France, who refused to rule out sending Western soldiers to Ukraine?
The headline is that Vladimir Putin yet again is raising the spectre of nuclear Armageddon. And he's doing it in the context of the threat that we've heard from Emmanuel Macron, but other Western leaders as well, that not immediately, but there was a possibility at some point of ground forces being sent by the West to fight in Ukraine. And he pushed back against that very firmly, saying that could lead to World War III and could see the end of civilization, I think was the words that he chose. In a sense, that's kind of what Joe Biden has said as well, that if we do end up in this war seeing NATO or Western troops from Western countries fighting Russia, it would quickly descend into World War III, and that raises the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. It's not just Macron, but the leaders of Estonia and Slovakia are also saying that it can't be ruled out that troops, boots on the ground, will have to be sent by Western countries into Ukraine, which of course is something the West has avoided because of the risk of it leading to a Russian-Western conflict. Macron and other Western leaders have to project resolve and unity, and they have to say things like they're in it to win it, they're in it to the end, and they will do whatever it takes. Nothing is off the table.
So what do you think the Western leaders will take from what they've heard? And will President Putin once again raising the spectre of nuclear weapons worry them, or will they think we've heard these threats before?
I think in public they'll push back against it, and they will say this is the Russian president crying wolf. As you say, he said it before in a number of different contexts. But I think privately they will be worried about not so much what he's saying about nuclear Armageddon, but the kind of tone, I think, of this address, the kind of defiant tone, the sense of newfound confidence and kind of optimism we're hearing, not just from Putin, but we heard something similar from the Russian ambassador to the UK in an interview with Yalda Akim a week or so ago, where he was saying again, the Ukrainians they were foolish to resist our invasion. It is inevitable that we will win. And I think they'll be worried about, most of all, what that is going to do to the hearts and minds of Ukrainians at a time when the war is going against them, when Ukrainians still aren't sure the West is behind them. And what they've got to do to make up for that kind of crisis of confidence, I think, amongst Ukrainians, is to give them a lot more in terms of military support, particularly in terms of munitions and artillery munitions. Denmark has given its entire artillery supply now to the Ukrainians. They'll be hoping to get more of that.
So sending out a message to Ukraine, to Western leaders, but as you say, also to his domestic audience as well. So what do you think he wanted them to take away?
It's interesting, the kind of curve that Putin's gone through during this war. Clearly, it went against him at the beginning. He didn't quite know what to say. And clearly, the Kremlin propaganda machine didn't see the invasion coming. I think a lot of those in the propaganda machine weren't briefed. So there was a lot of catch up. That then led to the Kremlin sort of giving the impression that the war was a remote, distant operation that's necessary. I think now we're getting a sense from Putin that it's not just distant, because so many Russians have died, that it is something now that's sort of more at the center of Russian consciousness, something they should be proud of. They should be doing what they can to support patriotically. That's the kind of the rhetorical veneer at the front of what Putin is saying and doing in government. Behind that, there are, I think, reservations and doubts. There's a lot of concern about, I'm sure, in Russian military minds about what Ukraine is managing to achieve in the Black Sea against the Black Sea fleet. But I think there's also a lot of concern about how long they can continue pouring Russian soldiers and Russian lives into the meat grinder, as it's referred to by Russians. I think there's an awareness that eventually a mobilization will be required to send more troops, and there's a concern, I'm sure, in the Kremlin about what that could lead to politically. But I think that these are concerns for further down the road. For now, the war is going certainly in Russia's direction, incrementally, but it's certainly moving in a direction that Ukraine doesn't want it to move in.
He's also likely to be mindful there's an election just around the corner in Russia. I mean, no real question that he's going to win that election, but do we have any sense of where public opinion lies?
These elections in Russia are now a charade, and they are not democratic exercises in choosing a new leader. So it's hard to say what the support will be for Putin. He will win outright, but that will mean very little in terms of how we can read his political support. I think a lot of Russians who oppose the war have left. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have left. It's an increasingly totalitarian state in the strict sense of the word, which means the government controls everything, increasingly also the minds of its own people. So when you're there and you talk to most Russians, try and vox pop them on the streets, most of them would say, if you ask them a tricky political question, would say, well, I'm not into politics. I think the election will show that he has total control at the moment, even though there is, I think, a certain amount of opposition out there. And I think the big concern at the moment is not so much about the war. If you look at what the sort of the information we have from what Russians are saying, it's concern about the economy, the pressure sanctions are putting on the Russians, the fact that food prices are rising inexorably, that inflation is an issue. There is a hope that a negotiated end to this war can be achieved. If there's a very low turnout, that will tell us all we need to know, I think, about opinion, about the mood in Russia as we move well into the third year of this war.
And of course, he will not be facing Alexei Navalny in that election. The speech comes just a day before the opposition leader's funeral, and yet no reference to Navalny in this long speech.
That's not a surprise, because Navalny is a name that Putin could never bring himself to utter. Had he been able to run that, he would have been a formidable opponent to Putin. He kind of was more a bigger name outside Russia in some ways, that many Russians didn't buy into his alternative view or vision for Russia. But he was somebody who could literally get tens of thousands of Russians out onto the streets and would have been able to do so in more normal times during an election. But no other meaningful opposition figure has been able to run either, as Putin guarantees himself success in this election.
Dom, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're going to pause there. And in a moment, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, will tell us about her trip across the Baltic states and the warning that they have for Western allies. Welcome back. Now, as I mentioned earlier, countries on NATO's eastern border with Russia are bolstering their armies in response to the war in Ukraine. And Deborah, you spent a week travelling across the Baltic region, so tell us a little bit about what you set out to do.
In recent months, a growing number of NATO commanders and defence ministers from across the alliance have been talking about the increasing threat of a potential confrontation with Russia, given what's happening in Ukraine, now entering its third year, and the situation on the ground is increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians as the Russians demonstrate their ability to withstand significant battlefield losses and yet still rearm. On the Ukrainian side, their Western allies are really falling short when it comes to re-equipping the Ukrainian military, although of course no one on the NATO Western side want to see Ukraine lose any more ground, and they want to see Ukraine win. There's obviously the reality of what Russia is throwing into this fight, and then the concern about what might potentially happen should Russia prevail in Ukraine. Might it then turn its sights onto NATO territory? Because obviously Ukraine isn't part of the NATO alliance yet. And so I really wanted to go to the Baltic states, which obviously shares that long border with Russia and a shared history, to see what they're doing and how they are mobilising and preparing to deter that threat.
So what did you find?
The three Baltic states, they only regained their independence from the Soviet Union in the early 90s, and they joined the NATO alliance in the early noughties. I think they joined in about 2006. And ever since then, ever since they joined, they've been sounding the alarm about the threat posed by their big, powerful next door neighbour. It really had initially fallen on deaf ears because back then, NATO and individual allies, especially the United States and the UK, were very much focused on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their warnings weren't heeded until 2014, when Russia initially invaded Ukraine, grabbing Crimea and backing this so-called insurgency in the Donbass, which had ultimately Russian forces on the ground as part of that. And that belatedly awoke NATO to the threat posed by Russia and the need to rearm and re-equip and spend more on their defences and push forces. They pushed forces in 2017 into the Baltic states and into Poland, but only in relatively small numbers. And it clearly wasn't enough to deter Russia from going further in Ukraine, which they then did 2 years ago with the full-scale invasion. And when that happened, you again had this renewed effort by NATO much more seriously to rearm and bolster its eastern flank, the defences. So you had more troops being put into the Baltic states, into Poland and into other countries in that region. But at the same time, the Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were also ramping up their defence spending, ramping up their industrial base, increasing the mobilisation, so the training of volunteers into their military, and also for Latvia reintroducing conscription, which they'd stopped back in 2006. And as well, they've announced plans to build a defensive line along their entire border with Russia. Estonia's been the one that's come out most publicly to talk about what that means and what it will look like, and it will include bunkers. But it really is about drawing lessons from the war in Ukraine and the need to prevent Russia, should it ever think about attacking a NATO state.
Is it possible to assess how great the risk is from Russia to the Baltic states?
Everybody is very alive to the threat, and they see the threat as something that could happen at any moment. And as long as that war in Ukraine is going on, there is the risk of a miscalculation, of a mistake. We've seen the threat of munitions fired by Russia. If they fell onto NATO territory by mistake, that could trigger an escalation. Or if you had Russian military knocking a NATO jet out the sky or something like that, that could lead to unintended escalation into full-blown conflict confrontation. But in terms of an actual deliberate attack by Russia on NATO, that's something that everyone is worried about. Everyone I spoke to really links it fundamentally to what happens in Ukraine, and how the need for NATO, for the West, to supply Ukraine with the sufficient weapons that it needs right now to be able to keep Russia from regaining ground on the battlefield, but also push Russian forces out. And the warning really is that if Ukraine is not given the equipment to prevail in their country, then that is when Russia might seek to look elsewhere. But it's important to note that the head of the British Armed Forces, in a speech this week, he really played down any threat to NATO's eastern flank in the next 2 to 5 years, unless Russia is able to rearm. But I would say that other voices are far more cautionary than that, far more anxious about the threat posed by Russia, because Russia is rearming, it is mobilizing its industrial base at a much greater level than the Western alliances.
You talk about that growing number of civilians being trained up, that conscription in Latvia as well. So what's the reaction been there to that? Because these countries have a really interesting relationship with Russia, don't they, given that they were once part of the Soviet Union?
The overwhelming majority of people in all three countries are absolutely vehemently supportive of NATO and of bolstering their defences against the threat that they see from Russia. They feel the threat more acutely because they're so close to it. And so the level of resilience amongst individual people is so much stronger there than it is in Western NATO countries, like here in the UK. I was talking to one senior official who was talking to me about the idea of conscription and saying how it's like if you drop a bit of litter on the floor, you don't expect somebody else to come along and pick it up. You pick it up yourself. And so in the same way, it's that idea that if you want to defend your property, it's not that you rely on on a small professional military to do that. You want to know how to defend it yourself. So it's that sort of sense of wanting to be part of the collective defence of your country. A senior general, a Latvian general that I spoke to, said to me about the whole concept of conscription, how it's seen as a cornerstone of a democracy, because it's not just about teaching people how to shoot straight or march. It's also about that sense of service, being part of the collective protection of your country.
And I imagine because of their shared history, you must have come across some people who were perhaps more sympathetic to Russia?
In Estonia, we went to the northeastern tip where there's a city called Narva. It's right on the edge. There's a river, and then across the river there's a city called Ivangorod, which is a Russian city. And so the border is so close, it's almost in reaching distance, and it's connected, rather ironically perhaps, by a bridge called the Friendship Bridge. And in Narva, the vast majority of people speak Russian. There are many Russian nationals there. There are some who are sympathetic to Moscow. And I did speak to an old man when I was there who says that he's loyal to Estonia, but he could never view Russia as an enemy, and he kind of just wishes the two sides could be friends. You do have the differing views about the threat that Russia poses and the actions that Russia has taken, which do play out in different parts across those three states.
And meanwhile, what did they say about what the rest of the NATO alliance and what other European countries should be doing to bolster their own defences?
I spoke to the Latvian foreign minister and I asked him, should the UK have conscription? And he said with a smile that he is happily sharing Latvia's experiences with his friends and colleagues. So clearly sort of making the point, you'd imagine, to other NATO countries about what's happening in Latvia. In the UK, for example, the military is so disconnected now with the public, whereas at a time of war, like World War II, it was an all-of-nation moment and the whole country was invested in protecting our land. And over the years, understandably, that's changed and the size of the army has shrunk. And so now the number of families that actually have any connection with the military is vanishingly small. People don't feel the threat anymore in the UK as we would have done back during the Cold War, for example. Now there is this huge fundamental shift potentially in the global balance of power, not just with what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but obviously it's got its backer, its friend, China, not actively backing the war openly with weapons, but definitely not criticising Russia in terms of its actions, and also Western allies very much concerned about what China might do in the future. So this sense that with the values of the West under threat, maybe it's time that all NATO countries and civilians, citizens, not just their militaries, take a more vested interest in that, is something that I think is kind of the sense that you get when you speak to people in the Baltic states.
Deborah, thanks very much indeed. And you'll be able to watch Deborah's report on our YouTube channel from Friday. Thanks so much for listening.